You're listening to CRM Audio, the Microsoft Business Applications and Power Platform podcast. I'm Joel Lindstrom. Joining me today are some new voices to CRM Audio. We have Cody Erickson from Microsoft. Cody is recently joined Microsoft from Softmotive. And we also have Mr. Flow Joe himself, Joe Unwin. Gentlemen, how are you doing?
Great, thanks.
Doing well. Thank you for the intro.
And Cody, I met you a whole 2 weeks ago, and we were in a presentation together, and I heard you tell the story of RPA and especially the Microsoft post Softmotive acquisition. So tell us a little bit about kind of your history with RPA and where you came from.
Sure. Yeah. So previously, I'd actually worked in kind of the data space, but moved myself across the country for this RPA technology that I came across. I saw a lot of opportunity for organizations to more effectively scale the way they resource their business. Is just kind of how I broadly saw the technology. And I started with a company called Thoughtonomy. They were acquired by Blue Prism after about a year of working there and rebranded to Blue Prism Cloud. And then I moved to Softmotive, where I was there for about a year and a few months before getting acquired by Microsoft. Softmotive, just a little background from them. They're they're the longest standing RDA vendor, desktop automation, and one of the longest standing RPA vendors in the space. They bring 15 plus years of experience. When you think about RPA coming out of the scene, Blue Prism kind of coined the term, was the pioneer in the robotic process automation space. I think it was 2004. And then right after them is, a year later is Automation Anywhere. A year later after that is UiPath, and right behind them is Softmotive. So we bring just as much tenure to the space. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why Microsoft was so interested in Softmotive as an acquisition, specifically because, one, again, it gives them that much more experience in the RPA space, specifically to their automation platform. Their automation platform, RPA is a component of that, so that's where we fit in. We talk more about it in the podcast later on, the broader intelligent automation platform. But again, we brought a bunch of tenure to that specific component of their automation platform, in addition to also flying very closly to the and aligning with a lot of their current strategies in this low code application development platform. If you don't know, they're top 2 in the quadrant for low code application development platform. So we're right alongside with that being the easiest to use on G2 Crowd. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but G2 Crowd's an enterprise technology peer review platform. So these are end users reviewing technologies over UiPath, Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere. We were #1 easiest to use in that same report. We also ranked higher on the average of those three and these certain statistics, about 18.67% higher adoption rate and about 6.5 months shorter to achieve an ROI. So again, a lot of these things, this ease of use flies very closely and is very aligned with their current strategy, in addition to, again, bringing some tenure and a quality product. I mean, it's a great product. But more or less, that's kind of, I think, what we bring to it. But I think Power Automate and even the Power Platform is a much more comprehensive approach. And again, maybe we'll dive more into that in terms of the reports and whatnot later on in the podcast. But
yeah, so the acquisition of Softmotive was met by surprise for some people, as maybe Microsoft having a vote of confidence or not a vote of confidence in their existing solution. How do you see that? What was the driving thing behind, if Microsoft had their own RPA, why did they need to also acquire a vendor like Softmotive?
So that's a great question. And actually, as long as I was in the RPA space, there's always talks of a tech giant and even specifically Microsoft acquiring somebody. So, Thoughtonomy at one point, there was whispers, and there was articles from HFS, I think, that wrote the UiPath might get gobbled up by Microsoft. And it's got this depiction of this large monster, sea monster eating a little fish that is UiPath. And so it constantly talks about that type of stuff happening. So from that perspective, not necessarily surprising to me being in the RPA space, but yes, from an outsider's perspective, when you look at Power Automate and even being in the space, I kind of looked at it and I was like, when I started hearing about it and when it happened, when it happened, I was just kind of, I thought they have an RPA or an automation solution themselves. I look at, they use Selenium for UI stuff, and I was just trying to figure out where the gaps in their solution was that they would want something like Softmotive. So, again, it just, I think that essentially where we fit in, now that I learned more about the Power Automate solution, Power Automate is great in the sense of, and if you look at the most recent Gartner report where they are the leader in the completeness of vision, it's this comprehensive automation solution. The last piece of the puzzle they were missing was that RPA component. They do extremely well in the API-based automation or digital process or DPA, that type of automation. They have AI built into their Power Platform as a whole and Power Automate, so that opens up that much more automation opportunities with virtual agents and OCR, sentiment analysis, data extraction, object detection, whatever. So they have all these things built in already. The component that I think that they weren't necessarily as strong in, and again, it's low code, built for citizen developers as well as professional developers without lacking that functionality. So again, this comprehensive solution, but they were just missing that one component of being able to manipulate the UIs of some of those more rigid systems, whether it's like an SAP that doesn't necessarily integrate well with other technologies, especially probably not Microsoft, or if you think about legacy applications or green screen terminals, that's where they were having a hard time creating a technology in a short order that could do that with a high level of sustainability. And
Joe, what do you think? You've been using all these tools for a long time, and you've written a lot about Microsoft's RPA when it was released. What's your perspective? What do you think?
I find it interesting that Microsoft went down this route of actually acquiring someone. Personally, when UI Flow came out, it was a little rough around the edges, but the overall concept worked quite well with Power Automate, being able to just launch and record, and everything was done via the browser and everything was uploaded to Power Automate, and it kind of fit in quite well. So when it actually happened, I was quite shocked. But was I surprised? Probably not, because it was fairly limited in the scope for what you could actually do with UI flows. So, I mean, from my background, if people don't know, my background is heavily in automation testing as well. And I come from a pro dev background where I actually was writing via C# or via Java, using Selenium, using the WinApp driver, etc. And actually being able to see this drag drop functionality being incorporated into Microsoft for citizen developers, etc., is awesome. But like, what I would put forward to you, Cody, is like, where do people get started? Because it kind of seems overwhelming, especially for citizen developers, because you have to obviously consider passing through variables and stuff like that. And some people just aren't familiar with these terminology. So how do you see that moving forward for citizen developers actually coming into the RPA aspect?
Sure. It's a good question. And I think it kind of, it starts with it being accessible for business leaders. We have transparent pricing on the website, so you can reference any of this stuff publicly. But I think as business leaders, you don't need to prove out every single use case and map it all out, because it is so accessible from a commercial perspective. So you can put it in the hands of business users who may not necessarily be ready to build automations and or save millions of dollars a year and still justify an investment. At $480 a year, across, if you were to do that times 100 people, even just one person. They gotta be able to automate 32 hours across their entire year. That's less than a percentage of their total working hours to justify that investment, right? So it's not daunting. It's not this, oh gosh, like I got a lot of pressure to now return an R or to create an ROI. It's gonna be fairly simple too, but so that's the accessible point of it. But in terms of the resources, there's a bunch of great learning modules that Microsoft has. Win Automation had an academy with certifications and diplomas and stuff like that. So there's a ton of DIY, do-it-yourself types of resources at your hands. But I think it really just kind of starts with the individual, and I think everyone has these processes throughout their day. You may not automate your entire job, but everyone's got little processes throughout their day where, I may find, being in sales, I may find a new lead on LinkedIn or something like that. And then I got to go and copy paste information from this person, guess and test emails and that type of thing, where all this stuff is very, if this, then that type of methodology. And I could just teach a software robot to do it. Like, oh, I like this as a lead, kick off, lead upload automation, and boom, it's in the CRM. Now, again, it's not going to automate me as a salesperson. I still got to go create the connections and do some of that, and those intangible things that a robot can't do. But, everyone's got a area for opportunity. I mean, myself personally, I had a free license working for the company. I created one to kick off an automation that submitted vacation the next month when I had a new amount of credits, like as we had accruing hours. And like I said, it was nothing. It was a couple steps, something simple. I just didn't want to have to come back to it. So I just played around and created something very easily. You don't need to boil the ocean, I guess, is what I'm getting at. It's just a matter of kind of looking into your own processes and how can I get little efficiencies so I can focus on the more important things in my day.
And it's interesting. I saw yesterday on LinkedIn, I know when this came out, maybe it was July or August, but since Softmotive acquisition, Microsoft has moved up in the rankings. I believe it's high in the visionary category for the RPA quadrant now, where before they weren't even on the board. So,
right.
And yeah, that shows, and it's just the net is, original RPA was good, but there was a whole world of applications like citrus applications that you couldn't automate. And those are really the ones people need the RPA for, because, we have such good capabilities through connectors and APIs and building custom connectors that, again, I get a lot of questions from my customers about RPA, but usually they're talking about more general automation. And I think you'd agree with me that you're still, you can do it with an API, that's still probably the more stable way to do it, right?
Yeah, and I think any technology professional would agree with that. When you talk about automating with an API first, again, RPA is a great solution, so I'm not trying to downplay that by any means, but where there's an API connector readily available and you don't have to pay money to build one or maintain it or anything like that, it's going to be a much more sustainable practice because you're going to have more control over the process. It'll be much more resilient. As an example, it won't be susceptible to warnings or pop-up notifications or even UI changes. If you're using an automation for, let's say, Salesforce, they changed their UI, Salesforce Lightning, that was a massive UI change, and they changed little tweaks to your UI every quarter, every year at least, for most of these modern applications. And that can break a UI automation, whereas if you have a direct connection, which Microsoft does as one of their API connectors that's readily available to use as for Salesforce, you can create that automation. And if there's a change in the UI or something like that, the automation is not going to break. So it's much more resilient in that regard, which also then reduces your total cost of ownership. You don't have to go back and then, change the automation or manage and maintain this automation differently because the UI has changed now.
So you mentioned maintenance there. That's a big thing in automation, right? For any automation engineer, they know that you spend most of your time really maintaining your automation process to actually have your tests run, have anything run. How how do you see the time spent maintaining your new UI flows essentially, and how do you see it actually digging into people's time and effort? Because I know with like code bases, you've got like code reuse, you change it one location. Do you see that as something that's going to be impacted on people's like experience with RPA?
So with RPA and Win Automation, even specifically, there are reusable variables and reusable controls. So like kind of that coding experience, you can reuse some of these components to speed up these things when you go to use it in the same application or the same control in a different scenario. But there's thousands of actions that are already readily available and thousands of templates that are already readily available for that reuse. And you can also build your own. Again, it's built for the citizen developers, but also built for professional developers to be able to create their own automations and that sort of thing. In terms of the maintenance, like I said, I think that just having that DPA or API-based automation relieves some of that stress. Again, if you're leveraging that wherever you can, and then using RPA where you have to, where an API is not available, you're going to have a lot less of that. And again, if you think about some of these situations, like let's talk about a legacy application, most of the times these homegrown CRMs or something like that, people aren't often keen, the internal IT teams aren't often keen on changing the UI. Like they don't necessarily need to make it look sexy all of a sudden for the same organization. Those legacy applications stay pretty stable in terms of their overall functionality. So you won't see as many of those UI changes as you would in like a Salesforce or these more modern applications, I guess.
Yeah. One thing as well that I've realized is not just these applications have APIs, these don't. Take Excel or SAP, which a lot of accountants you interact with. There are connectors for both those applications, but there's a whole bunch of functions that aren't exposed through an API. And so it can also be a way to extend the API integration for things that need more of a UI-based interaction with the application too.
Yeah, also a great point for sure.
It's also, it's also a great story for the bridge to the upgrade, because sometimes you need something now, but you're changing something in 18 months, but you need to make your users' lives easier now too. So that's the other things where I think RPA has a great bit, and I think it's great that it's available now. I mean, it's not like some acquisitions that they're acquired and then 2 years later you can use them. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but people who use Power Automate can start using the Softmotive RPA right now from their Power Automate flows, right?
Yep. I think anyone who had an existing Power Automate license then got Win Automation as kind of a complement. But now, it's an option that you can buy on there. And again, that's the $480 a year. It's this per user license with attended RPA. And that's what the attended piece is, that Win Automation, which was a Softmotive product. And essentially the way to access it is you're creating an automation within your Power Automate. And it's simply an action that you're sending to this installation of Win Automation. So right now it's two separate interfaces, with obviously the intention that it'll be one cohesive product in the near future. But right now, it's just you install the desktop installation of Win Automation on there, and then you just doing your Power Automate as you would. And I got to access this funky system. Send action to Win Automation, and then go build, author that automation within Win Automation, and then it comes right back to Power Automate.
So is that only attended, or are there unattended options too? With Win Automate?
Yeah. So Softmotive had a process robot enterprise tool that had both unattended and attended. Win Automation was the single license desktop installation, but Microsoft, I know, already has unattended automation as well. And then unattended automation essentially is just it's there's a difference in how it's deployed. They're often deployed on a VM versus a desktop. So the VM it doesn't need a physical desktop to run an automation or whatever. But that's really the only difference. And the answer is yes. Microsoft's Power Automate has an unattended.
Right. I was just curious if the Win automation could also be used in unattended. I mean, Joe, you've done a bunch of RPA, right?
Yeah, so for me, like I use Power Automate to spin up a VM, which I've already created with my legacy application on it so that you can scale. And then I can run specific RPAs on that particular VM that I want to run. And then you get the results back to Power Automate, and then you can effectively do what you want with those results. So you can kind of build your own unattended workarounds if there aren't unattended offerings straight out of the box, just using like the Azure VMs or whatever. Yeah, so that's great. I have a question about really how you see this moving along in the future. You said like it's going to be into like one product. Do you see it's going down the like visualization of UI flows where you're going to be able to actually control a lot of it in the web, or is it going to be desktop based majority, do you think? I don't know how much you can say about that.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of information, so I wouldn't want to mislead anyone listening in. But it is Power Platform and Power Automate as well as a cloud-based software as a service. So I think the intention would be this unified platform and kind of the UI and the way that you're able to access Power Automate. That would probably be the ideal. I don't think anything's going to change in that regard. It's just a matter of integrating those other products and functionalities into that. Yeah, the Power again, I would kind of default to whatever Power Automate is and Power Platform is currently is what's going to be the future state, just with additional functionality.
Yeah. Yeah, that I can imagine they would come together for sure, and I'm excited to see what happens there. So since you've worked with RPA for a long time, different platforms, I've seen some people write articles about how their experience with RPA didn't live up to the hype or the promise. And so it makes me wonder, what have you seen that the people who are most successful do, or maybe the ones that aren't as successful it could be? What are some mistakes people do that kind of diminishes the value of their RPA?
I think first and foremost, it starts with expectations. RPA has been on the scene for 15 plus years, but it really didn't kind of get all this attention until started getting all those big funding rounds and everything. And all of the vendors started receiving big funding rounds. I mean, Blue Prism was already public, so they didn't necessarily go that route. But I think most importantly is setting expectations. When you have this application that has the ability to interact with any business system within any company in any industry of any size, anywhere in the world, the opportunities seem endless, the possibilities seem endless, and they are, but it's not a silver bullet. And even though these things are built to be easy to use, and ours is Win Automation and Microsoft's. Both their platforms were the easiest to use. There's a learning curve, and like you said, there's a mindset as well that you have to adhere to create an automation. It doesn't do the work for you. You have to go in and kind of think critically, like, how do I work through this process typically to create a real resilient and sustainable automation? How do I work through this process? What are the exceptions that I face? Oftentimes we're just on autopilot, and we've done it a million times. We don't think about all those nuances. So I think that's part of the critical thinking. And again, it's mainly expectations that aren't being set properly. So
I've had customers that had an RPA solution, and that they had it controlled by a small group of, almost you thought they were like PhD data scientists or something, and they kept this to themselves, and if somebody wanted something automated, there was a big process to go through, and it would take them 6 months plus for some even basic automations to get developed and rolled out. And I see some people make the same mistake with Power Apps and the Power Platform in general. They use it, but they have a small group that guards it, and this is ours, and nobody else can have it. And I think that limits the return on it. Sure, you want controls over this stuff, but by keeping it so segmented that only this group can use it, and not having any quote unquote citizen developers or anything be able to even touch it, really limits its usefulness.
Well, there's a couple things I would comment on that too, and Joe, I don't mean to jump in or interrupt, but there's a couple things I would comment in that regard. It's one, RPA is kind of built in this idea. It was built in this idea to be able to empower frontline workers to create their own automations, rather than IT having to solve all of our technical business challenges. And it's common across all types of organizations, whereas IT has this laundry list of technical items they need to deliver to every other business unit, plus their own issues within their own internal departments. So you get that backlog. And if you just do the same thing with RPA, whether it's in the IT department or a separate department, if you take that siloed approach of everyone, the entire organization is feeding their request to a small group, it's going to, like you said, it takes 6 months. They got to prioritize. It's like, oh, wow, we have thousands of requests. I got to figure out, okay, which one's the most important, which one's going to create the most impact, and then I got to go build it. But I also have no subject matter expertise in this particular process. I got to sit down with that subject matter expert. It's this huge process when you silo it. So having a technology that's accessible, $480 a year, where I could pay for that personally. I'm not going to sweat over that if I had to pay for my own license. So when you have something that's accessible, you don't need to have this siloed approach. You don't need to justify every single use case and prioritize and have this huge process for creating automation. And secondly, I think I lost my train of thought there, but that one kind of being the main thing, I guess. But yeah. I don't know, Joe, you're about to comment as well?
Yeah, how about you? So I think that a big thing to take away from this is even though things can be automated, it doesn't necessarily mean they should be automated. Because I've seen that a lot, and I've seen it a lot within the Power Platform. Like, people are creating apps just for the sake of creating apps. They don't necessarily need the application, then you've got to have someone maintain the application, etc. It's exactly the same with RPA. If it may be worthwhile actually doing it manually rather than actually creating an automation RPA for it, because it just may not make sense to do so. And I think that's a big takeaway, is you need to focus on what's going to be your good return on investment, what's actually going to take away needless tasks from yourself and actually free up you to do better work. And yeah, I think that's a big takeaway.
Hobbit himself, Sean Tabor. Sean?
Hey, everybody. I completely agree with Mr. Flowy, Joe, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's one of those scenarios where when you first think of RPA, at least my perspective, it was, wow, I can automate stuff in other systems and not have to do any coding. But it's not exactly as simple as that, because there's a lot of things you have to think of, which I'm sure in the time that I missed you already discussed. But it's I'm glad we have the capabilities now.
So that's an example. I automated my life with notifications when there was a new posting in a message board, and I now have an email box full of emails that I don't care about. So I should have listened to you, Flo, Joe. All right. So Sean, from your perspective as being Mr. Field Service, what do you see in the field service world for RPA? There seems to be a lot of really intricate processes around keeping a field service schedule going and things like that. So it seems like that would be a place where there would be a lot of potential. for automation?
Well, really, one of the top concepts I would have for RPA would be something that would allow you to kind of componentize parts ordering, to where when you're going to when a technician goes to request a part, using the standard field service capabilities with purchase order, for example, to do that could then, you could take information from that purchase order form and, using RPA, automate that within the ERP system to create either a sales order or transfer order, et cetera, to initiate that parts order.
Now, is there typically not an API for that, or is this additional things that you can't typically do with an API?
Well, it depends on the ERP, right? If it's finance and operations, then yeah, you could create a project and you could do that pretty easily with the supply chain management integration that's coming in wave 2 and everything. But when you're dealing with SAP and Oracle, having these kind of processes, it depends on, let's say it depends on whether or not your technician's a subcontractor or an employee, and whether or not they have ability and access and they want them to be submitting this. There's a number of factors, but realistically, trying to have a simplified process to enable something like that, to where you don't have to have this holistic, massive integration pipeline, I think would be pretty exciting. In
your scenario, are they typically mobile in the
yes
mobile? So that's where, again, that's where that wouldn't necessarily be an intended RPA thing, because they would be on a phone or something, not in front of a computer, right? So, Cody, what do you think about that scenario when you have things maybe extending to systems that don't use API, or that you don't necessarily have the API or connector for, but the people launching it are not in front of a computer? They're maybe on a phone or something.
So basically, it kind of, in relation to what you're asking me, initiating something from like a mobile device.
Right. And the idea is there's APIs for the other ERP systems, but something that would, for maybe a smaller customer who doesn't want to have the ability to make the investment in having that full integration done, using something like RPA to take information from the field service form that's captured on mobile, and then using RPA to create that service order rather than an integration per se.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, and I'm not sure if this directly applies, but hopefully it does. I saw an example when we were kind of trying to differentiate, Microsoft's automation offering compared to just traditional RPA vendors. And in part of the technical demo, I didn't put it together. I'm not quite that savvy myself. But one of my colleagues put together a scenario where a health insurance provider, they would use the Power Apps. They developed an app, so you would use that mobily, obviously. But they basically could take a picture of a form while out in the field, let's call it, and so the app is the means in which that information is consumed, and then it's digested using AI Builder to extract the relevant data points from that form, rather than consuming the entire form and just copy pasting it into a Word document and have somebody sift through and find the relevant data points that go into that systems of record. The AI Builder is able to extract the important pieces from that lengthy document and then pass to Power Automate to go put into those systems of record. So it's this kind of interconnected experience, and I think that really summed it up, in my opinion. Again, like I said, if you go to a traditional RPA vendor, they're not going to have that sort of capability available to you. They don't have Power Apps, and most of them don't have AI already built in. You have to go to like a third-party vendor. So that was a really interesting use case to differentiate. Does that kind of apply to what? Maybe not directly, but in a sense, to apply to what you're talking about?
It does, and we've seen other examples where you could have a subcontractor doing field work for a customer that is not connected to the Dynamics instance, right? So, for example, you could have a work order that's assigned to a employee, but there is a service task that is related to the subcontractor doing field work. The field work subcontractor has their own system. Let's say they're using NAC, right, just to collect that data. That information could come over in an email or in a spreadsheet. Then we could use that with RPA to update the other systems. So I can see a lot of potential. It's just really trying to understand when and where to apply that potential. And
well, I can see, like, I had the exterminator come to my house last week because we've had some ants, because we were in the summer in South Carolina, and that guy had in his truck a laptop that had legacy systems on it that he was filling in, because they had, probably some of the systems they're using when they do a call or look up information and things like that. It's not just all in the field service app. It might be other things from other systems. And so what I can see is if something had to be sent to a billing system or something like that, that could be an RPA process. And could be an unattended one, or the customer service, common scenarios where somebody is resolving an issue with a customer and then also creating an order for a replacement part that pops up the green screen order system and passes the customer information into it. That's the part where, kind of removing those limits. Or just, another scenario, that things dealing with hardware. So, I'm working with more manufacturing customers, like to build app types things around their manufacturing process. And many of them want to print out barcodes and things like that, or use existing hardware on premise and things like that, that APIs can't, unless you use something like Google Cloud Print, can't make it print. And so that's the power I see there, where things like F&O have the printing and the automated printing processes in there. But if you're trying to build something with a Power App or something else like that, having the ability to trigger that really completes the solution. I mean, you look in the Power Platform or Power Users Forum for the number of people looking to print something from a Power App. It's amazing that they don't have that yet. But that's the kind of thing where I think we're seeing a fair amount of interest in the RPA for that. So we were talking about, common mistakes people make with RPA. Joe, you've been doing it a long time. Anything else, or what you've seen be the most successful? Maybe let's be positive here. What have you seen for RPA when it works well? What are some common characteristics?
I think common characteristics of working well with RPA is knowing exactly what your limits are with your application and what you're trying to achieve from them. So, for example, if we take a scenario where we have the instance of we have a legacy application and we're moving into the Power Platform, we're using CDS as a data store now, etc., and we want to get some information from our legacy application that's still being used by agents in our business, knowing that what information you want and actually setting up an RPA in an environment it's going to be run on, you need to think about how that's going to be run, because you're going to have it like some kind of attended or unattended, right? You're going to have an Azure background where you can actually spin up a VM and have your application on there, or alternatively, you're going to have a system in your office that's waiting for RPAs to be run on. The problem is that a lot of people think, okay, I've created an RPA, it's ready to go, let's go, it's all done. They don't think about actually maintaining the actual hardware for their RPA to run on. So for me, I think that especially if you're a smaller company, you should be thinking about actually having your stuff run on a VM, because you don't have to make the initial investment into infrastructure in your own business, as well as you can scale, because if you've got like 100 different RPAs you want to run on one system, you can then split it up to say 10 run on one VM, 10 run on another, 10 run on another, and you can scale astronomically. You can run in parallel and you can get that information back a lot faster. And I think the hiccup is that a lot of people just think, okay, I've got an RPA that I want to run. I've created 10 of them now. But then if you're doing it in a sequential order, it takes time. RPA does take time compared to an API call. So you've got to kind of weigh up what you want to do, how you want to achieve it, and how fast you want to get it back as well.
So is the process typically writing it, testing it, and then scaling it to get to the performance you want?
Yeah, I mean, I would always consider scale at the beginning. Like if I want to just, I don't know, enter some information on my timesheet, I don't need to scale that. So I'm just going to write the RPA and get it done. But if I'm working with a business that needs to get information back quickly to someone, then I know that I'm probably going to have to create multiple RPAs to achieve this. So I'm going to then think about how I want to scale straight away. If I'm working with a smaller business, they probably haven't got the infrastructure internally to have multiple systems just sitting there waiting for RPAs to run on. So then we have to think about VMs on the cloud, etc. So yeah.
Well, and then I can imagine too, more than like an API-based integration, since it's so dependent on the UI. We all know, have worked with companies that have the legacy ERP that once a month is hit by the month-end process and slows way down. So you have to account for that. I'm assuming when you write it might work great and quickly when you're testing it out on the third of the month, but if you get to the first of the month or whatever, you need to plan for that and plan that into your scale too, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that this kind of comes from like a QA mindset. You kind of have to think, okay, I'm testing this on this device right now and it's working. But as a consumer, what can happen? What can actually happen during this run that may cause it to not work correctly, i.e. the end of month update or something like that. So you kind of have to have this kind of QA mindset of your approach to actually scaling and creating RPAs as well.
So Cody, from your experience, what's the typical path into RPA? Do people typically have a set of processes to automate and they start there and then build from there? Or do people generally start with a bigger bang where they've got, many processes to automate? What have you typically seen?
Yeah, it kind of just depends upon the maturity of the client. I mean, when I worked at Softmotive, we worked with a number of clients that already had RPA installations of another vendor of sorts, or maybe a couple even, and they were coming to us for something more specific. And for clients who are just net new to RPA, starting out with it, a lot of times people have a pretty good sense of at least a few processes that they want to have automated, and kind of to talk to like what Joe was talking about, success factors or things to that are good indicators of success. I also kind of caution clients to not try and take your meanest and most complex process and try and automate that, because that's going to be your biggest bang or whatever, or your biggest relief to the business. It's a very good way to potentially, if it's unsuccessful, kind of soil the grounds for a potentially really impactful technology. And if you don't get that instant success, then it kind of muddies the waters a little bit. So I definitely encourage, starting simple. That's my suggestions to clients. But again, they have their own idea of what they're coming with a pain point or a challenge or something they want to automate oftentimes. And some have one process or two processes, some have 5, some have 10, some have a list of 30 that was whittled down from 300, so just depends upon the maturity of the client, I guess.
And if you haven't done RPA, what's the typical profile of a successful RPA maker, if you will? What are they typically, developers, or are they typically more business IT pros? What have you seen, kind of the typical profile look like?
It depends upon the technology. So if it is one of the more complex ones, again, I work for a Blue Prism company, and they said a combination between IT and kind of a business analyst sort of mindset. When I worked at Softmotive, there were some that they again took the centralized approach. It was more of a developer that was focused on building automations, and then there was others that it was just a business analyst that was building them out, and some were just somebody within the finance department. They had familiarity with RPA and macros and stuff like that. So it really depends. But I guess if I were to diagnose it, and you have at least a solution that is easy enough to use for somebody who doesn't do coding and stuff like that, would be somebody who is a critical thinker. Again, it's kind of that analyst mindset, but has the ability, to kind of break down these processes step by step and kind of see the bigger picture, and then also have the, I guess the sort of the self motivation to do so as well, because it is picking up a new technology. You're not. If this isn't your designated role as RPA developer, you got to be willing to put aside some of your own time for a potentially greater outcome for yourself as well as your company. So you got to be a little bit of a self-starter, I guess, as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've come to appreciate is with both Power Apps and Power Automate and RPA, you don't have to be a developer to use them, but it's very helpful if you have somebody on your team who has a developer mindset. It's not necessarily the writing code, it's thinking like a developer, being able to break a process down and also follow good development practices, not just doing something and throwing it out there, but testing it in the QA mindset that Joe talked about. But again, that's something as well people can learn. And so, especially if you can work with a partner or work with someone who's more of a developer on your team to get those practices, and then you can go forward from there.
So what would you say? I mean, that makes a lot of sense from a development perspective and creating the RPAs. But what would you say is the difference between the team that you would typically have to maintain and manage an RPA automation, as opposed to, I guess the A is automation. So anyway, to manage
automation.
Yeah, to manage the RPA, as opposed to the team that would typically manage an integration, right? So I mean, is it the same people? Is it different?
I'm not really sure I'm familiar with the setup of what would maintain an integration, or the team, the makeup of that team. So I'm not sure I can answer that question with a bunch of confidence, but
I mean, are you doing the similar monitoring for throughput, for how are you monitoring the success and failure of the RPA as opposed to what you might be typically doing for an integration?
I think the difference between an integration and automation is the scale of it. An integration is you're connecting systems and processes in both cases, but one case you might be moving 1 million records,
right?
Versus the RPA is typically a transactional, one at a time, could be 20 at a time or more. So there is a thin line between that.
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense.
But I think you do need to look at have error. That's those developer practices around error handling and other things like that, and making sure that things are retried. You got retry counts, in Power Automate too, and frequencies and that sort of thing. And if you don't understand that, you can have failures that don't happen. And I think that depends on how mission critical the process is too. Some are less critical than others, and if they fail occasionally, nobody cares, versus if somebody doesn't get paid or an invoice doesn't get paid or something doesn't get delivered to a customer, that's critical.
Right. And I think that's the difference between necessarily having a business analyst who's available to create the RPAs as opposed to a more technical administrator to manage and oversee the monitoring of the RPAs, to my mind.
Yep. And I think it goes into things like the Power Platform adoption framework that talk about the criticality of the work stream. And you have some that maybe IT doesn't care about, that, each line of business is creating their own. But then the ones that are more mission critical, then you have more rigor, process, testing around them too. So this has been great. Cody, really appreciate you coming on, and I could tell how passionate you are about RPA, so I thought you'd be the perfect person to have on here. Because again, when RPA first came out, I thought it was interesting. Now I feel like this is really a thing and is something that, really takes away any limits we had with Power Automate virtually. So any systems we couldn't do with Power Automate, now sky's the limit, basically. So
yeah.
If people have questions for you though about Power Automate, or about RPA, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you? Are you on Twitter or LinkedIn? What do you prefer?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Cody Erickson's the name, Erikson.
Profile, the show notes.
Yeah, let's say, but I also, if you reached out to me there, again, I'm not sure what the demographic of the listeners are, but if LinkedIn is where you find this and you find me, feel free to reach out there, and then, I'd be happy to give you my email and connect you with the appropriate resources and subject matter experts with whatever your questions may be, if it is me or if it is somebody else. But yeah.
And
thank you for having me.
Cool. Flo Joe, with your impressive beard, really thank you for coming on here too, because again, you actually know something about RPA versus myself, who's dabbled with it, but I haven't actually done that much with it. I'm doing more with it now, but appreciate you sharing your experience too.
Well,
yeah,
and me, awesome. And me, who could barely articulate the acronym. So
RPA.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, and join us next time on CRM Audio.